Yeah, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We now continue with a presentation of Molly Slavin.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. My name is Molly Slavin, and I'm an assistant professor of English at Clark Atlanta University in Atlanta, Georgia. I want to just preemptively apologize for kind of the setup and if any small children are running around in the background. It's very early here, and my household is kind of starting to wake up. But I'm really excited today to be talking about urban spaces, crime, neoliberalism, and social justice with all of you. So, when I was asked to present at this symposium, I was trying to think through how to frame my earlier work on the topic of cities and crime through this more explicit ideal spaces lens. There we go. My book, Criminal Cities, the Post-Colonial Novel and Cathartic Crime, looks at literature set in London, Belfast, Sydney, Mumbai, Johannesburg, Nairobi, and the Palestinian West Bank in order to interrogate the connections that can be found among crime, cities, and colonialism. In that book, I use literary close readings to bring to light the political and cultural ramifications of literary depictions of crime, specifically neocolonial structures and imperial legacies like structural racism, neoliberal economic structures, and continuing colonially derived violence. I argue that the preponderance of descriptions of crime in postcolonial literature, rather than specifically crime literature, is a phenomenon worth examining seriously. Despite not being genre crime novels, many post-colonial novels, especially those set in cities, feature crime as the central narrative plot point or thematic idea, a tendency I term cathartic crime. So, cathartic crime, as a way of understanding power, is a way to read instances of crime in novels as potential routes to re envision the contemporary neoliberal city and world into ideal spaces. In cases wherein the novel achieves a just or emancipatory outcome, the instance of cathartic crime can move beyond catharsis's traditional eschewal of real-world action and spur readers to become aware of and act upon lingering colonial injustices and inequalities in their own cities and environments. I have significantly cut down the scope of the book for this presentation and reframed it so that it looks more closely at what a neoliberal agenda in conjunction with discourses on crime does to human beings and social community in contemporary urban space. So this presentation will thus examine the matrix of crime, cities, and colonialism by linking together a general theory with case studies on literature set in London, Johannesburg, and cities in the Palestinian West Bank, examined through the lens of neoliberalism in the 21st century. So first, I'd like to start with a more detailed explanation of what I mean by cathartic crime. Cathartic crime is a way to understand crime as depicted in literary texts and specifically novels, which I can sort of talk about a little bit more later if anyone's interested, as a route for literary characters to experience collective social catharsis and to urge readers to participate in social and political life. Catharsis shifts according to context. In some cases, it may be expressed as a dominant population's anxieties over crime, while in another, it may look like a subaltern population experiencing oppression due to being labeled as criminals. But the common structural theme that translates across all cities and sites is the idea of crime as a receptacle for larger cultural and structural attitudes and formations, like racial capitalism, ongoing segregation, colonial urban planning, and rhetorics over violence. Essentially, all stories are crime stories. Even Hamlet is a murder mystery mapped onto larger political intrigue. In much literary fiction, crime features as a central topic or hinge on which everything else rests, and my work explores why this is. In other words, I argue for the necessity of reading depictions of crime in literature, not necessarily crime literature, as receptive sites for anxieties and fears surrounding literary, philosophical, material, and political changes in urban environments. Sorry, I'm having a talk. The way we talk about, construct, and depict crime tends to reflect what society in general is feeling. Frederick Jameson has argued for, quote, the priority of the political interpretation of literary texts, and has written that literature may be read as a, quote, symbolic meditation on the destiny of a community. So I am generally borrowing from this idea to argue that crime is a form of collective or political unconscious, especially for post-colonial novels set in cities. We never, as Jameson says, really confront a text immediately in all its freshness as a thing in itself. Rather, texts come before us as the always already read, We apprehend them through sedimented layers of previous interpretations, or if the text is brand new, through the sedimented reading habits and categories developed by those inherited interpretive traditions. So the relatively brand new contemporary texts studied for this presentation are approached by readers then through the quote, sedimented layers of ideas surrounding crime, cities, race, gender, and other imperial formations and residues. Correspondingly, literary depictions of crime often reflect back the tensions, nostalgias, or disquiet felt, consciously or unconsciously, among larger populations, both dominant and subaltern. These populations will experience crime in vastly different ways. Privileged classes will often place a high emphasis on property crime or other crimes against capital out of fear of losing their position in society, while subaltern populations will have to deal more often with their behaviors being coded as crimes by a colonialist and neoliberal society, as at the same time they are confronted by crimes of violence, hate crimes, and targeted crimes against identity. The common denominator, however, is that crime is used in the post-colonial city-centric novel as a way to work through and negotiate legacies of empire, including neoliberalism, to achieve a kind of emotional catharsis, whatever that means for the relevant population. By seeing how characters in novels experience cathartic crime, we as readers in the body politic can become more attuned to reflect and act upon how we see similar patterns in the quote-unquote real world, and hopefully, in so doing, work to make our cities into more ideal spaces. So now let's turn our attention to London, the former center of the British Empire. So it's virtually impossible to talk about crime in London without discussing Margaret Thatcher, the neoliberal example par excellence. In 1978, Margaret Thatcher gave a speech to the Conservative Women's Conference in which she said, all over the country, and particularly in our large urban areas, people do go in fear and trembling as never before during the lifetime of during either the lifetime of their parents and grandparents. Why are these city residents going in fear and trembling, you might ask? Well, Thatcher continues due to rising levels of crime. Some people might believe those levels are rising due to things like higher unemployment, poor housing, poor pay, but Thatcher and the conservative women know better. Rising crime, of course, is not due to society, but to the steady undermining of personal responsibility and self-discipline, all things which are taught within the family. So this remarkable soundbite manages to contain so much within a few short sentences. Cities are places to fear. Recent changes, most likely demographic and racial, are making the world less safe. Social welfare is to be disregarded in favor of the nuclear family. The important things are within each individual's control. It is this general neoliberalizing and privatizing ethos, combined with the lightly coded fear-mongering about race wrapped up in rhetoric about large urban areas, that has played such a large role in creating what we will analyze as the contemporary criminal city of London. Thatcherite legacies still structure the city 40 years later, even after the eras of cool Britannia and third way economics. Post-war and post-colonial London, no longer the metropolitan imperial center, is now a place where, as John McLeod says, the urban and human geography has been irreversibly altered as a consequence of patterns of migration from countries with a history of colonialism. So that London, in certain circles, functions as a code for non-white and somehow dangerous or criminal inhabitants. In 1973, Raymond Williams identified a common British attitude towards London as perceiving the city as a, quote, source of social danger and a place of, quote, darkness and poverty. These negative associations have only become sharpened in an age of imperially derived racism and neoliberal economic policy. So as a short example, I'd like to look at a brief scene from Zadie Smith's 2012 novel, N.W. In this scene, two main characters, Natalie and Nathan, are going on a nighttime stroll around their neighborhood of Kilburn in northwest London. Natalie and Nathan are both Black and discussing their childhoods and contemporary lives. Nathan reminisces that in their school days, he was good at math and very talented at soccer, but that he doesn't, quote, like to think about them days. At the end of the day, I'm just out here on the street grinding. He tells Natalie, there's no way to live in this country once you're grown. Not at all. They don't want you. Your own people don't want you. No one wants you. Ain't the same for girls. It's a man thing. That's the truth of it right there. We see here both the neoliberal space in which they both live Nathan has to grind every day to survive, and the way race overshadows how both of them are perceived and relate to their city. It's clear from this passage who gets perceived as a criminal in the neoliberal space of London, racialized Black subjects, and specifically men like Nathan, and how it affects the ways individuals live and understand their place in the world. With that in mind, then, I'd like to look now at Ian McEwan's 2005 novel, Saturday, and how its depictions of urban life in a neoliberal society degrade individual humans as well as communal life and flourishing. Henry Perron, the protagonist of the novel, is a middle-aged white neurosurgeon with a loving wife, intelligent and beautiful adult children, and a successful career. He lives in London, runs long-distance races, enjoys cooking, and regularly visits his mother in an elderly care facility. Besides his prowess in the medical field, there is very little to distinguish him from the masses of other upper-class white men who populate posh districts of North and Central London. His very lack of distinguishing features is itself remarkable. It is not fair to call him average. He's too wealthy and holds too prestigious a job for this. But there is very little to mark him as different from the generic type of white man who holds this kind of job and lives in a wealthy part of a major Western city. So Perron has no strong stances in his individual life either. We are told on the very first page that as he wakes up at 3:40 in the morning, he is not disturbed, quote, even by the state of the world. This general indifference to the world around him continues throughout the novel. Though he is living in London on February 15th, 2003, the day of a large anti-Iraq war protest. In fact, many British media sources, from the Daily Mail to the BBC, claimed this protest was the largest protest of any kind in London's history. He has no strong feelings one way or the other on the impending invasion. He does not appear to be interested in or even aware of debates surrounding economic and social justice. As we shall see, they simply never seem to occur to him. He seems entirely focused on getting together ingredients for a small family party that evening, as he will be welcoming his daughter for a visit from Paris. This is Henry Perron, a good and bland neoliberal subject, benefiting from the current economic environment, checked out from his surrounding community and city, and reliant only on himself, his family, and his immediate work associates. Though in the actual book, I spend more time examining Henry Perron's day in relationship to the city, I'd like to skip ahead to look at a scene where readers are given an image of how Perron views the world around him, its supposed threats and criminal motivations. So we learn that Perron tries his hardest to cut himself off from the city at large, living as he does behind front doors that come equipped with, quote, 3 stout Bantam locks, 2 black iron bolts as old as the house, 2 tempered steel security chains, a spy hole with a brass cover, the box of electronics that works the entry phone system, the red panic button, the alarm pad with its softly gleaming digits. Lest the reader miss the point, McEwan continues, such defenses, such mundane embattlement, beware of the city's poor, the drug addicted, the downright bad. Such an intense level of security reflects the larger social anxiety over an increase in crime and specifically what it does to Henry Perron's mindset. He is Margaret Thatcher's aphorism brought to life. There is no such thing as society. There are individual men and women, and there are families. Perron views society as something to wall his family off from, to protect them from at all costs. His home is his fortress, and it is very necessary for him to ward off all crime or even all non-family members. Even though this novel was written well before the advent of the Ring camera, this scene calls to attention the paranoid effects of that device. The way crime and neoliberalism discourses work together to create an atomized world where individuals are othered, where people huddle in their homes and their cars without engaging with the broader public. No opportunity for engaging with the broader world is thus possible, and the only possible catharsis for these discourses of fear and loathing can come through eventual violence against those who neoliberal discourses have taught people like Perron to fear. And for those who have read the novel, you'll know that all of Perron's security precautions don't even really accomplish much, as the novel hinges on a home invasion that I can go into later if people are interested. So this image of Perron's door with its intense security brings to mind another writer in a different urban space. Ivan Vladislavic's Johannesburg and his work Portrait of Keys, there we go. Portrait of Keys is a 2007 work comprised of 128 short vignettes about life in Johannesburg. The piecemeal novel begins as such. When a house has been alarmed, it becomes explosive. It must be armed and disarmed several times a day. When it is armed by the touching of keys upon a pad, it emits a whine that sends the occupants rushing out, banging the door behind them. There are no leisurely departures. There is no time for second thoughts, for taking a scarf from the hook behind the door, for checking that the answering machine is on, for a final look in the mirror on the way through the hallway. There are no savored homecomings either. You do not unwind into such a house, kicking off your shoes, breathing the familiar air. Every departure is precipitate. Every arrival is a scraping in. So the image of the alarmed house calls to mind the constant anxiety and time awareness that accompanies those living in urban spaces marked by neoliberal discourses and overblown fears of crime. The situation is related to that of London, though with, of course, the shadows and legacies of the racist system of apartheid hanging over the city. Lindsay Bremner writes that Johannesburg, quote, has become a field of violent contestation between extreme wealth and extreme poverty, between luxury and subsistence, idyll and inferno, excess and need. And that into this neoliberal situation, a new discourse and set of practices have emerged, those of crime. In other words, now that apartheid has ended, fears and anxieties of crime have arrived to fill the old system's place and to serve much the same function. This is not to say, of course, that living in a city does not carry danger. Of course it does, and crime is real and can be harmful. But my larger point is that as apartheid began to be recognized as a crime by the international community and then South Africa itself, that system of clear-cut rules and structures was discarded in favor of the more fluid and neoliberal system of criminality. This looser system of criminality was utilized in order to help South Africa cope with the end of apartheid by sliding in a new form of ostensibly colorblind exclusion and oppression on top of an older, more explicitly racist one, thus relying on a type of emotional processing or catharsis. So Johannesburg is the largest city in a country that has seen Portuguese, Dutch, and British imperial influence, and until the late 20th century, occupied under that system of strict racial segregation known as apartheid. Though not formally instituted till 1948, apartheid built upon systems of racial segregation initially put in place by both British and Dutch imperial rule. Apartheid's intensities and formal codifications into strict law were a post-imperial innovation, but apartheid can be seen as an imperial legacy in that its general purpose was to solidify the hold white Europeans enjoyed over indigenous Black Africans and the mixed colored population, once the formal protections of European rule had left the country. Moreover, because, quote, land has been a critical factor in the colonial encounter, as David Walsh says, and apartheid focused heavily on controlling access to land and space, quote, apartheid can surely be grasped, argues Rita Barnard, as a deliberated and anachronistic perpetuation or reinvention of the spatial and epistemological distortions of imperialism within one country's borders. Apartheid, simultaneously a system of domestic imperialism and a hangover from imperial rule, was also tied up with discourses of criminality from early on, both in the sense that the system was a crime, a violation against any basic understanding of human rights, and in that it instituted a far and wide-ranging set of crimes in the sense of a legal concept and what is or is not against the law. Because of apartheid's many rules and regulations regarding what people could or could not do based on skin color, it was virtually impossible to keep abreast of the many ways one could violate apartheid law and thus be conceived as a criminal. As Lauren Kruger writes, the apartheid order created instead a determinedly provincial criminal city, not merely in the broad anti-apartheid sense of a regime that violated international human rights, but also in the classification of most inhabitants as actual or potential offenders against a host of laws defining group areas, separate amenities, and urban areas, and thus as foreigners requiring expulsion. That last point, the idea that fellow South Africans are perceived as foreigners deserving expulsion, is the key idea I want to dwell on as we look at one more passage of Portrait with Keys. Though Władysławicz also almost never discusses race overtly in this text, it's quite clear from reading who the perceived criminals in Johannesburg are and who the vast majority of the white citizens are protecting themselves from. This results in a city devoid of communal space, built on fear and anxiety, that does not allow for individual human flourishing or the understanding of other human beings as co-inhabitants of an ideal space. For example, Johannesburg, which is a very car-centric city, itself a result of neoliberalism we could spend a lot of time talking about, is somewhat notorious for car theft and carjacking. A concern, of course, but the way Vladislavich portrays its inhabitants as responding to it is very telling. The seventh vignette in the text reads as follows, in its entirety, reads as follows. When my car, a white Ford Meteor with 80,000 kilometers on the clock, was stolen from outside my house, I immediately phoned my father. He listened sympathetically. Then he asked, "Did you ever get yourself a gorilla?" He had been pestering me for months to buy a steering lock, and I had been putting it off. Now the car was gone. I was on the point of lying. "Yes, Dad, I got myself a gorilla, just as you suggested. But the thieves cut it off with an angle grinder. Went through it like butter. But you cannot deceive my father about such things." "No," I said sheepishly. "I meant to. I really did. But for one reason or another, I never got round to it." "That's a pity." There was a long, crackling silence. "You know, the guys who make the gorilla are so confident about their product. They offer the purchaser a special guarantee. If your car gets stolen with the gorilla in place, they'll refund half the excess on your insurance. Ah, well, once bitten, twice shy. Perhaps you'll be more careful next time." I find the scene interesting because it combines the overblown fear of crime with the reality of it, as does Peron's door locking scene in Saturday, though from a different angle. In this scene, the car really does get stolen, although no one is harmed. However, the conversation the narrator has with his father indicates that the two spend a not insignificant portion of their relationship talking about crime and how to ward it off. I chose this novel to discuss because I think it, in conjunction with Saturday, does a good job of illustrating how the neoliberal city's concern with crime changes the way everyone functions and relates to each other in the city. We can see from the literature set in London and Johannesburg that we've looked at so far, the way the neoliberal city processes crime affects everyone's survival and relationships in a fragmented and atomized world. There is no opportunity for catharsis in a world of such anxiety and paranoia, no way to reach a satisfying conclusion to a literary work or to the narrative of everyday life. I'd like to wrap up by looking at how discourses of crime function in the space of the Palestinian West Bank and its urban areas. Crime in the Palestinian context is typically defined from above. In other words, the Israeli forces have the power and ability to define what constitutes a crime and what does not. Palestinian writers are aware of this power imbalance and play with it in order to disrupt the representational script, working to elucidate the illusions that exist between low-level Palestinians' crimes, such as marching and organizing, and the international silence around war crimes, such as ethnic cleansing, destruction of cultural sites, and the creation of displaced refugees. By articulating the immense gaps between perception and reality, Anglophone Palestinian literature, and specifically Hala Alyan's 2017 novel Salt Houses, works to reach a global audience to educate readers about how discourses of crime work in the neoliberalized urban spaces of the occupied territories. Hala Alyan's 2017 novel Salt Houses traces the history of the Yaqub family over 4 generations, told in a series of vignettes by rotating members of the family. The Yaqubs, displaced from Jaffa in the Nakba, land first in Nablus, then spread from there to Jordan, Kuwait City, Beirut, Paris, and Boston as the years go on. This city-based diaspora considers several different kinds of urban life, from ancient cities like Nablus to 20th century creations like Kuwait City to Western spaces like Paris and Boston. As each generation migrates to somewhere new and forms their own lives in the diaspora, they are haunted by the events of 1967, when Mustafa Yaqub, a young man in the second generation of the narrative, was accused of some nebulous crime, thrown in jail, and killed. The family never knows the exact details, and the lack of concrete information haunts them over the decades. This yawning vacuum shapes everyone's lives for generations to come, the creation and deployment of the concept of crime against Mustafa affecting the family for years in a kind of domino effect. This is, of course, in light of the multiple crimes carried out against the Palestinian people that the Yaqubs witnessed, from the Nakba of 1947 to a return to Palestine in 2014. The immense scale of these crimes against humanity highlight the heartbreaking nature of Mustafa's arrest and murder. Readers do not encounter the Yaqub family before or during the Nakba. The first vignette, told by Salma, takes place in 1963 in the West Bank city of Nablus, the center of Arab nationalism. The family fled from Jaffa to Nablus after the Nakba, when the West Bank was occupied by Jordan. Nevertheless, Salma's children have still have run-ins with the occupying Israeli forces in the city of Arab nationalism, as when her son Mustafa and his friend Atef, this is a quote, were arrested at a demonstration in Jerusalem.
In another time, their offense might have earned them a fine, merely a court-issued warning. Instead, both Atef and Mustafa were kept in the penitentiary for 4 months. Salma's understanding that the Israelis have constructed their concept of crime arbitrarily in ways that benefit them, she notes the punishment for their crime changes on the need of the occupiers, underscores how crime is utilized to prop up the regime of the colonizers to recreate colonial conditions early established by the Ottomans and the British. This time, however, as the Yaqub family tries to escape the oppressive conditions in the West Bank, they realize that everywhere they go to escape the crimes of the occupation and the accusations of crime against them has been shaped by neoliberalism, making full-scale human flourishing impossible. For example, one set of family members, Mustafa's sister Alia and her husband Atef, who was Mustafa's previously mentioned friend, decamped to Kuwait, a place Alia despises and Atef adores. Alia pleads with Atef. Instead of staying in Kuwait's wasteland, the endless afternoons of television and heat, let them go to Amman, the coffee shops and vendors, hawking fruit, neighborhoods filled with old friends. Alia despises the recent creation of Kuwait, hates its gleaming and, to her, artificial nature. She remembers her older sister, Widad, telling her stories about the Bedouin, how a mere 30, 40 years ago, none of this had existed. None of the villa compounds or courtyards or even the pearl-hued mosques. Hearing these stories, Alia feels a pang of sorrow for the older generation, the men and women who still remember the desert before all the construction. The newness, the rawness, the atomization of Kuwait is an affront to her. She wishes to go somewhere with what she views as a past, a history, something to root herself in, to work through her pain over Mustafa and their exile. Atef feels extremely differently. He adores the newness of Kuwait. He tries to imagine the development of the city in his mind. In Atef's imaginary photographs, the transformation is astonishing. In the beginning, a stark desert, the landscape sparsely decorated with industrial buildings and compounds. And then whoosh, years pass and things begin to crop up. Restaurants, Indian, Pakistani, Lebanese, with bright signs. The newer mosques, the billboards cautiously advertising toothpaste and banks. And slowly, the cranes and concrete pillars, dunes of sand, turned into construction sites. What Alia views as falseness or a loss, Atef sees as exciting, an opportunity for a new start. He loves going to the market, a place where nobody wanted anything from him except coins. He revels in the transactional nature of the place, eschewing Alia's vision of Amman and the tight-knit community that awaits them there. Going back, inserting himself into his past, would force him to encounter daily the wound of Mustafa's death and the related notions of crime, culpability, and loss of land that go with the murder. Atef is comfortable in Kuwait because of its dissimilarities to Palestine. And this particular neoliberalized urban space seemingly fits his needs well, though in the long run, it simply allows him to hide from his past without ever fully confronting it. However, it is this note about Atef that I wish to end on, this hiding from the past instead of fully confronting it, because ultimately I think that's what neoliberalism and its related violence does to all of us. We become people who go to the market where nothing is wanted from us but coins. We lose any sense of history, of community life, of things that matter. We replace those things with paranoia, with Ring cameras, with locks and fears of carjacking and admiration of neon signs and cities rising from the desert. Crime shapes all of our urban experiences, whether we are the ones enclosing ourselves in our fortress homes or the ones being enclosed against, whether we are driven out or forced to stay against our will. Frameworks and paradigms of neoliberalism ensure that, in the end, none of us can thrive in a city where we are asked to always be cognizant of crime, to always be thinking about incursions on the self. So I began this paper by briefly outlining my theory of cathartic crime, so I'll return to that here at the end. Catharsis, a sense of closure, is impossible in contemporary discourses on crime because we can never see our way out of the problem. By design, crime is a self-perpetuating issue. We'll never solve it, never see the end of it, never reach a satisfactory conclusion, especially in neoliberalized urban spaces. Crime discussion is designed to keep us fearful, keep us worried, keep us anxious and afraid of our fellow human beings. But one thing we can do is to continue to draw attention to these rhetorics, what they spring from, and how they can be combated in various settings and examples from around the world. These short excerpts from various novels we've examined in this presentation help to illustrate this, but I also think it's worthwhile to talk about why we like to talk and think about crime. As I said at the start of this presentation, all stories are crime stories. We love transgression, romance, danger, the opportunity to process our emotions through someone else's stories. As Bertolt Brecht has pointed out, quote, "It is enjoyable just to see people act, to witness actions with actual consequences that are attainable straight away." But we continue to yearn for something more than just individual release or solo reading, At the heart of it, we know that neoliberalism and imperialism are unjust, and we crave rebellion against these things. Some of the most powerful stories of cathartic crime let us imagine that rebellion and then motivate us to enact it in hopefully communal form. Crime in literature has more meaning than we give it credit for. It plays a more substantial role than entertaining us on the beach or on an airplane. It represents a significant societal, collective grasping for catharsis and change in a rough-edged and unstable, atomized and fragmented world. The novel, then, and literature more generally, can offer us glimpses of our current reality and allow us to imagine what future ideal spaces might hold. Thank you very much.
The neoliberal agenda, it seems to me it's really important that the citizens be misinformed and be lied to and be regulated in a sense.
There is a deliberate effort to keep us uninformed or misinformed. If they really believed what they said, the approach would be, right, we've got to inform people as well as possible about all their choices and then allow people in this free market to make those choices. So we inform them that if you burn fossil fuel, you can create climate breakdown, which then has these impacts, etc. But no, it's exactly the opposite. There's been this massive effort to shut down sources of information. If you look, for instance, here in the UK at the war against the BBC, which was once a pretty good source of information, it's now been populated, its board has been populated by people placed there by the government to impose a viciously neoliberal agenda to ensure it just simply doesn't cover most of the topics that we're talking about. I don't remember the BBC ever talking about neoliberalism, for example. I can't remember the last time there was a critique of capitalism on the BBC. It's an extraordinary thing, and it talks about being balanced and impartial. And you say, yeah, but you're not even discussing the major forces in our society. How can that possibly be the case?
There was a massive campaign by the petroleum companies to bury information about climate change.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And interestingly, that was greatly supported by this international network of think tanks. These dark money funded organizations, which were absolutely fundamental to burying public information about climate breakdown. And most of them refuse to say who funds them, but when we find out, we discover, oh, surprise, surprise, it's the oil companies, it's the tobacco companies, it's the property developers, it's the financiers, it's all the people who benefit from the propaganda that they've been putting out.
Which are the major think tanks in this direction, working for the neoliberal agenda?
Sure. So organizations like the Institute of Economic Affairs, the Taxpayers Alliance, the American Enterprise Institute, the Heritage Foundation, the Hudson Institute, the Cato Institute. There's 500 members of the Atlas Network, which pulls together these neoliberal junk tanks from around the world. And there's other of them which aren't members of the Atlas Network, but have a very similar function. Many of them were set up in ways which deliberately disguise their purposes. There's some very interesting memos come to light about the setting up of the Institute of Economic Affairs, saying, we should be cagey about its true purposes. We should not say what it really stands for. We should create the impression that it's an independent, free-thinking organization.
Wow.
It's quite amazing, it's like, this is about as dark as it gets.
So there's this connection between public relations and neoliberalism that goes back historically, yes?
Yes, but they are the sort of public relations vanguard for neoliberalism. These lobby groups, these junk tanks, and they're very effective. They're very good at it. They pay big salaries. They employ clever people. They just all repeat exactly the same things. They might sort of turn them a little bit, and the effort always is to make the extreme ideas proposed by people like Friedrich von Hayek, like Ludwig von Mises, like Milton Friedman, to make them look like political common sense. And they often say those words, common sense. This is a common sense position. And you say, no, it's not. It's an absolutely outrageous, extremist position. We hear it so often and so persuasively that it can come to seem like common sense.
We need isolated individuals, no? in their seeming omnipotence, treating the world as an application, as an app, but in fact they are just consumers, and that's it.
A very important and neglected aspect of this is that fundamental to neoliberal belief is this idea that what's good for one is good for all. That if someone is pursuing their self-interest, that's going to be good for society as a whole. And they endlessly cite Adam Smith's talk about the invisible hand of self-interest, which delivers good for everyone. But what we now know is that it really doesn't work like this. And one of the ways we know that is from the 2008 financial crisis, where you saw people very fiercely pursuing their own self-interest, designing all these exotic financial instruments, which made them very rich, all these derivatives and collateralized debt obligations and other things that no one really understood. And it brought the whole system down. And the reason it did so is that the financial system is a complex system. The economy is a complex system. The human society is a complex system. And these complex systems create patterns as a result of billions of random interruptions, which generate, through the inherent properties of how complex systems operate, negative feedback loops and positive feedback loops. They respond to stress according to a whole load of criteria, which we're only just beginning to work out. How many connections does each major node have? How well distributed are nodes within the network? I mean, there's a vast scientific literature on systems theory now, but only just beginning to grasp some of the ways it works. But one of the things shows very clearly is that everyone pursuing individual self-interest, it can be entirely rational from their point of view, but it can be absolutely devastating for the system as a whole. Because if you're pursuing efficiency within your business, which can make a lot of sense for the business, you reduce the redundancy of the entire system, and that creates systemic fragility. Similarly, if you all pursue the most profitable option, which is generally the same thing, and one of the points that was made in the wake of the financial crisis is that all these companies were pursuing so-called diversification strategies, but they were all exactly the same diversification strategies. So it had the opposite to diversification. You reduce the diversity of the system, and that also makes the system more fragile. Okay. If you're constantly chasing the latest economic trend, which everybody does out of self-interest, you reduce the asynchronicity of the system. In other words, the behavior of different parts of the system starts to synchronize. So if a crisis is generated in one place, it goes everywhere across the whole system. So I estimate, I sort of boiled it down to sort of 6 elements of systemic resilience. And each one of those elements is undermined by the pursuit of self-interest within the system. And so as soon as you see it from the point of view of systems theory, you understand that what's good for one is not good for all at all. It can be exactly the opposite. You can be pursuing your rational self-interest. You can be completely logical in what you're doing. But the collective effect of so many people doing that can be to destroy the system as a whole, which is what happened in 2008. And it was bailed out at the 11th hour with a massive global rescue package, as neoliberalism so often is.
So we would be very, very happy, or more specific as regards the systemic effects, how the system works. As you outlined it. So what will happen in a system from the system dynamics?
In principle, I'd love to do all of those things. I mean, my problem, as always, is time, and I'm always massively rushed. In fact, right now, I'm going to have to move on to write about the Labour Party manifesto, which is just about to be published. So,
okay, George, before you leave, George, just leave us with a few words about what the future looks like for you, okay?
Yeah. Thank you. So you know, the positive and fascinating thing about systems theory is that now we know that society operates as a complex system and society has tipping points. We have no reason to despair. You know, people despair because they think that society is a simple system. I mean, they don't think about it in those terms, but they imagine that it's a simple system. The only way you can change a simple system is through linear, granular change, where you have to do it just one at a time and you have to achieve a majority of thought. And we're never going to do that, you know, and it never has worked like that. You don't create political change by persuading everyone in a society. That has never happened in human history, and it never can. No, you don't. You create political change by achieving a social tipping point. And basically, society is a complex system with two equilibrium states, one called impossible and the other called inevitable. And what tends to happen is that we start off from a position where everything we want is impossible. Just for women, you've got to be joking. The end of apartheid, come on. Civil rights, independence for India, any of the things that we've ever wanted, marriage equality, the end of smoking in public places, that's always impossible. They would never let it happen. You know, there's too many people opposed to it. It's just locked in. And then it happens, and we all say, well, that was inevitable, wasn't it? Yeah, and it's flipped. And so how does that flip happen? Well, it happens through a group of dedicated people, a small group, reaching out to the nearest people to them and saying, look, you know, you're halfway here, but let us tell you about this and pull you into this campaign and get you engaged in it. And then that next concentric circle reaches out to the next one. And you then get to a point where enough people, and some early research suggests it could be about 25% of people, are committed to this new idea, this new change. And then it's not that everybody else is persuaded by it, but people sort of sense something's changed. You know, oh gosh, the status quo is shifted and I don't want to be left behind. And it's a combination of that and the inherent tipping points of society. And suddenly, bang, it's gone from this impossible position to this inevitable position. And then all the people who weren't persuaded, who weren't part of it, they're not persuaded. They don't say, yes, well, in the light of this new evidence, and because of these very powerful arguments you put forward, I've changed my view. No, instead they say, well, I've always believed in equal marriage. You think, no, you haven't. I know you didn't. I know you were fiercely opposed. You thought it was going to be the end of civilization as we know it. But I'll let you believe that you've always believed in equal marriage, because after the war, everyone became a member of the resistance. Right? You know, you don't want to be the person who's left behind. And so we let people believe that. And people aren't persuaded. They just go with the flow. They go with the social flow. And that's how societal change happens. And we could be that close to the next tipping point. We don't know it until we've passed it. But until we've crossed that tipping point, it remains impossible. It's always going to be impossible. It's always impossible. We can't do it. Oh, despair, possibility. Then it suddenly happens. You say, well, of course it happened. Of course it happened. So the scale is irrational. You know, what complex systems show you is that hope could be just around the corner.
This is very important. How to change things without falling into despair and resignation.
Thank you so much, George.
Lovely to
Thank
talk to
you.
you.
Thank you.
Cheers,
Many
and you.
thanks.
Sure.
Many thanks
Bye-bye.
for the discussion. In order not to let wait Molly for discussing or for listening at the discussion at least, please. As regards these two presentations, as criminal cities and then combined, compared, reflected with what Monbiot said about the general situation of dissolution and deception, and the impossibility of this certain Weltbild and approach of the neoliberal agenda to keep stable conditions, and to reflect this for the crime situation brought by Molly from very different and very interesting and different perspectives from three different cultures.
Brenda is saying what Agamben said post 9/11 about the inception of the state of exception for security reasons seems to be also very apt in the context such as Johannesburg, where the reality of crime is real. Oh, okay. But the threat of crime is mobilized by the neoliberal powers that be to diminish public space, depoliticize citizens, and attenuate civil liberties. And Nicolas is here, and Juan Pablo are here. So.
Thank you for the invitation. Okay, so well, Juan Pablo Rodriguez and Nicolas Angel, we are from Chile. Sorry about the delay and about timing. We are 6 hours behind you. It's early morning in Chile. That's why also I had to miss the previous presentation, unfortunately. We're going to present how some of the neoliberal effects of neoliberal policies in Santiago, Chile, are currently resisted and by a group of pobladores or low-income families who try to create their own spaces different from the spaces of the neoliberal cities. So the title of the presentation is Undoing and Resisting the Housing Crisis, Community and Struggle for Dignified Life in Santiago, Chile. So a bit of historical background on the neoliberal city, just in Chile as in other countries in the world, is a historical product. So I would like to emphasize that before the neoliberal city, there was another type of city, and by the destruction, the colonization of the traces of the old city. From the previous city model is expressed. I'm going to show you just one of the examples. Here we can see this old building. This old building is part of the social building projects from the Allende government, the Villa San Luis in Las Condes, one of the upper class areas in Santiago. This is the original social building project. It's important because in this project, the working people worked in the planning of this project. They also participated actively in the construction of the buildings. And now you can see how this, this is a picture from last year. So here we can see a shopping center, and one of the this area now is we call it Sanhattan, which is the financial area in Santiago. So this building was built upon the social building project from the Allende government, and it's like a very clear image of the effects of the neoliberal city in Santiago. This is just one of the example. There's a long history of struggle for dignified housing in Chile. This started from the houses crisis with the migration for rural workers to the city. There had been like a lot of occupations, landing occupation in the history of Chile. So the pobladores, the people, the low-income family people, have been very active in creating their own spaces before, like the neoliberal city. That's the point of contextualizing the struggle. Some images of the kind of constructions that in which the urban poor lived in Santiago. This is from 1968. So there was a radicalization of the pobladores movement during the 60s and the 70s. Left-wing parties sought to connect the moral expectations of the poor residents regarding a decent life with the promise of a revolution. So in the 60s and the 70s, the pobladores movement became very radicalized. They were in close contact with left-wing parties, revolutionary ones, and also with the government of Allende and the Popular Unity. This is one of the, here we have one of the quotations of one of the pobladoras. The struggle for a home has cost the people hundreds of lives. The dignity has rejected arms and paternalism. Only what they can conquer with the effort belongs to them. There is a very important sense of like own effort, and the struggle is from below, that they don't want to like ask a favor to the state, that they are like the very protagonists of their own history, and so on. Then we had the Great Transformation, which is the formation of the neoliberal housing management system in Chile with the Pinochet dictatorship. So from 1973 onwards, there were efforts to depoliticize the housing issue, especially comparing the previous period. There was the process of municipalization in 1974, in which the competences were transferred from central to the local levels. An important point here is that municipality has to provide their own funding for housing problems. So poor areas and poor districts and municipalities were therefore left with no fundings. There were urban development policy in which urban land was highly commodified in 1979, and also there was a communal reforms in which the number of municipalities were doubled based on the principle of social hegemony. Here is the fragment of a quotation from a presidential message by Pinochet himself, and he clearly stated here the central idea for him for housing and the right to housing. He said, housing is a right earned through effort and savings, for which both the family and the state share responsibility. In this sense, housing is no longer a gift from the state. So this is like a pretty good example of how the dictatorship understood the housing policies. One of the main policies, or one of the main expression of the neoliberalization of housing in Chile was the evictions, in which many families poor of the urban poor were evicted, were displaced from well-located areas in which they historically lived in, to the peripheries of the city. So the left, you can be like the map of displacement, in which you can see like the white spots goes to the black spots to the peripheries of the city. So these were called erradicaciones de los campamentos, or campsite from the pobladores. So between 1979 and 1983, the dictatorship evicted 21,000 families just in the period. And then we came to the democratic period in 1989. Democracy returned to political democracy returned to Chile, and with it new housing policies. So in principle, the Concertación, the center-left government, wanted to tackle the housing crisis and they were actively involved in housing policies between 1980 and 2000. The state built 1 million and almost 2 million homes, 43% of the total housing stock. And since 2000, almost 70% of the poor population has lived in some form of housing built by the state. So here we have like a clear change in the way in which the government understood housing policies, and they were active involucration, participation of the state in building housing, social housing, and providing social houses, especially for poor families. And this is where neoliberalism becomes interesting, or more interesting, in the Chilean case, because when we talk about the neoliberal city, clearly we have this historical background and the dictatorship in which the neoliberal city was kind of created or enacted through evictions and so on. But like the current state of the neoliberal city has its origin here with the democratic government and the active participation of the state in building social housing. There is a series of institutional mechanisms through which landing still is highly commodified in Chile, and also the way in which poor families get social housing is marked by neoliberal type of management and logic. We will see here now some of the characteristics of the current housing policies in Chile. We still have an emphasis on private property. Still, housing is a community, not a right. Pobladores must compete for the allocation of subsidies. So poor people have to apply for these subsidies so they can get this social housing. The participation of these poor people, beneficiaries for the subsidies, is minimal, even if in collective application processes. And the individual is reinforced through the promotion of individual effort and savings stimulated by NGOs and companies, which with the state manage the social houses provisions. We have a graphic showing the actual housing deficit, the purple line. So it's about almost 500,000 families or households deficit, and then we have the red line is very important because it shows us the number of allegados. Allegados are poor people who had to live with relatives because they don't have money and they don't own their own home. So they usually live in poor areas in overcrowded conditions. Here we have two pictures of the new face of housing policy with the return to democracy. We have Bajos de Mena, Puente Alto, in which poor people were displaced from well-located areas, usually in the city center, to the periphery with no educational, cultural, neither social services. So here you can see the peripheries and how these poblaciones, how these areas were created by the democratic government. And on the right, you can see Villa Estaciones Ferroviarias, and this is social houses which got rain during winter. So the quality of social housing was and still is very poor. That's also a characteristic of the current housing policies. Here we can see a map from this is a map of Santiago, and again, black spots are like the peripheries in which poor people live now, and they were evicted for more central areas which were well-connected area with services, access to culture, etc. In 1899, the resident of one of the districts of Santiago, Peñalolén, decided to occupy land owned by a businessman, Miguel Nasur. So for the first time, the mobilization goal was not just access to home ownership, but also obtaining housing within a specific location in the city. And this is the very this is the main demand of these poor families from the pobladores movement. They are not just struggling for getting access to housing, not any housing. They don't want to move to the peripheries, but they want to stay put in the poblaciones, in the central and more well-located areas. So that's the main demand of the struggle. So although the housing policies developed by the Concertación between the 90s and 2000, it was a solution from a quantitative point of view, because there was a huge deficit. The pobladores evaluate them as a deterioration of their living conditions. So the Concertación kind of created a new problem by solving it through a neoliberal logic. So this displacement to the city's peripheries implies this disadvantageous position regarding the geography of opportunities and the deterioration of the identity and the threat to the dignity. Since 2000, so a new cycle of mobilization for the right to housing and the right to the city began. This was since the Peñalolén land occupation. So currently we have several organizations that are looking for a repoliticization of the housing issue. Land occupation are not longer the most visible expression of this struggle, but rather the organization of housing committees, which through pressure directed at the state, including land occupation, demand the construction of dignified housing. So pobladores, people from low incomes, got together in these housing committees, and they press the state for the construction of dignified social housings. In many of these organizations, the right to the city has emerged as a grammar through which the housing demand makes sense, and residents are motivated to secure high-quality housing in a good location to link among and between in decent conditions. So this is the context of the emergence of the new pobladores movement. I'm going to skip this part just to emphasize that the new pobladores movement want to avoid residential segregation and avoid the negative consequences of that residential segregations. Here we have some of the picture of these new pobladores movement. They are very active. They participate in marches, rallies, pressing the state for the right to the city. One of the leaders says, we want to build neighborhoods. We are our own neighborhoods. We are the producers of the city, not client of the state or of the market. And as producer of habitats, we want to create our homes, our neighborhoods, and we don't want them, the state, to tell us where and how we should live. This is Guillermo González, one of the leaders of one of the organizations. So pobladores themselves see as producer of the city. They emphasize that the spatial production of the city is foremost a social production of the city from below, where a new type of social relations can be visualized and practiced. These social relations are based on honesty, respect, on solidarity. They also enact the principle of autonomy, as you can say you can tell from the previous quotations. And autonomy for pobladores imply the creation of different instances of self-organization and self-productions of spaces, houses, and services wherein the state is not present. So pobladores themselves, the pobladores see themselves as the only people who can solve their own problems because the state is not present in their life. In where the state is present, the state is present to displace them to the peripheries and to live in poor quality conditions. There are like instances of self-formation and self-education, which are also important for pobladores. They have like pre-university training courses, school for adults, and these experiences are also important in order to create their own spaces and try to break try to break the neoliberal logic which are present in the poblaciones, in the areas in which they live. Self-education serves the purpose of an ideology critique from and within the territories. They are very critical of the neoliberal policies and the way in which neoliberal policy had depoliticized the urban issues in general and the housing issue in particular. So the main idea here is that these pobladores had to create their own spaces and they have to provide for themselves with social services which are not present in these areas. So they educate themselves, they create instead of culture of recreation for children and the families. They create spaces for political organization as well. So they try to resist fragmentation and fight neoliberalism in their territories by organizing themselves, by coming together, and by struggling for dignified housing and dignified lives. There is an example of this kind of counter logic or counter hegemonic projects from below in these areas, which is the Maestranza projects. The Maestranza projects are self-managed urban projects located in the city center in Estación Central, which is a central district in Santiago, a very poor district, by the way, and was an urban project politically conducted by one of the pobladores organizations called UCAMAU. And here practices of self-management and autonomy serve the purpose of resisting the allegados displacement of the comunas of origin to impoverished areas on the outskirts of Santiago. So there were 5 years of occupations, pickets, collective work with professional urbanists and members of the councils, in which 400 families now live in formerly empty state-owned land, in which it was the main train station located in the past, but that was an empty land until these pobladores came and pressed the state for the building of social building in this area. So the pobladores participated in the design and planning of these projects, the Maestranza project. Many of them also worked as actual constructors and built the city. So this project is unique in that they got the approval to build larger flats than the minimum standard for council housing in Chile. And this is very important because they managed to build not only better buildings than the building that the state provide to the urban poor, but also they built more, better quality building than many of the actual buildings provided by the market nowadays. So this is a mock-up of the projects. And here you have the actual project, which is functioning currently. So you can see here small but green playground area for children. You have this light with no wires, which is very typical in Santiago and especially in very poor areas. And here you can see two women from the pobladores with the home ownership titles. So this was the result of 5 years of picket demonstrations and meetings with the council to get the land and then to get the projects done. Here you can see like these children, how they enact the communitarian logic in a more everyday life space. And this is very important because in the same district, Estación Central, this is the kind of building that the markets provide. They call it vertical ghetto in Estación Central. These buildings are very close to the Maestranza project. So, well, it's very clear the picture. On the left, you can see still the old buildings in which poor people or working class people lived. And then you have these new modern neoliberal buildings in which now working class people also live. These are not social housing, by the way, but this is the type of housing which the market provides. In terms of the demand and how the pobladores like do this, fighting this, they have like a motto, which is our struggle is larger than a house, and this presentation we wanted to emphasize how the sense of community is important for creating these counter-hegemonic spaces for pobladores. Their discourse emphasize concepts such as vida buena, good life, and vida digna, dignified life. This is taken from indigenous ideology of world view. In this framing, the good life and the dignified life, vida buena and vida digna, allow the pobladores to make sense of the possibility of producing their own physical spaces as the Maestranza project, their own social bonds, their own family dynamic, and building also the collective dreams. They allow pobladores to experience concurrently and with it neoliberal society a new form of life. So the fight for a dignified life has two meanings. Firstly, the pobladores' demands are not reduced simply to the right to housing. As I have said, the right to housing is secure at some point by the state, but it's a very poor quality housing, etc. So they demand include, among other, access to basic quality services such education, culture, green areas, environment, mobility, and safety, which is very important. So Doris Gonzalez, one of the leaders of the Camao, one of the pobladores organization, she says, of course, the dream is much bigger than a house. That's why in our projects, she was very active in the Maestranza project. That's why in our project, we talk about the good life. And when we talk about the good life, we talk about alternative social relationships. What we do in our assemblies, for example. So they were describing the way in which relate to each other in assemblies, like with respect, try to talk to conflicting issues and try to negotiate, etc. Different from the neoliberal type of social relationships, which are competitive, individualistic, and so on. A different way of building society, different from the way we learn from capitalism and its neoliberal expression, which privatizes everything, denies everything, and sells everything. Communities for pobladores then are counter-hegemonic spaces of resistance to neoliberal and capitalistic logic of production and ways of living. Community have been historically very important for the urban poor to deal with the pauperized condition of life. It's thanks to communitarian logic that pobladores have survived in the past. They survived during dictatorship with the help of families and with the help of and solidarity of other working class people or other urban poor people. They have been able to undertake many activities that for the middle class are solved by the market by the bourgeois or within the bourgeois family structure. So community have been very important because they can work under the principle of solidarity and trust. And nowadays we can see the actualization of the same principle and the same communitarian spirit. Pobladores nowadays fight to stay put in their communas of origin, their district, to stay together. They defend their territories and resist being displaced and separated. In parallel to the unifying force of capital neoliberalism, so pobladores resist, defend what makes them one, their houses, their neighbors, and their community. Here's a kind of long quotation, but yeah, it's just 2 minutes to finish. This is by Guillermo, another of the pobladores. I come from a super poor background. My dad abandoned us when I was a child. My mom did everything alone, and despite that, I went to the university. I finished my career. Under the dictatorship, especially in the ollas comunes, the communitarian pot that were raised by the community too. He's saying that he got like fed by these ollas comunes. If my man could go to work, it is because there was a neighbor who took care of us when my mom worked, who sent us to school, who gave us a plate of food, and those kind of things. Without a communitarian philosophy, we've been fucked up because community is not a philosophy, but a way of life. In the end, the idea of speaking and forming a community is to break the capitalistic ideology, a true individualistic logic. You could have a community with your peers, with your colleagues, that you can make feel good. Obviously, it's not a matter of making a sect. That's why we also prefer a large scale fight within, without, and against the state. So in conclusion, we see in the experiences of these pobladores organizations the attempt at creating spaces of hope within the neoliberal city. And this is very important to remark. Obviously, these experiences are not like, they are not as, how do you say? This is just, there are very few experiences like this in Santiago. I mean, the rule of course is the neoliberal city, and that's the buildings and the picture that I showed like at the beginning of the presentation. That's the kind of landscape that is hegemonic in Santiago. But still, we wanted to emphasize that within this neoliberal city, there is a space for creating these spaces. So pobladores develop this set of prefigurative practices through which it resists the exclusion and violence of the neoliberal cities. These practices stand in opposition to the prevalent individualistic values of the neoliberal agenda, in which the families are forced to compete with each other for housing, subsidies, and benefits from the state. So the idea of community linked to a territory and a history works as an actualization of previous struggles, but also serve as a living proof that it is possible to maintain social relations based on non-capitalist ideas or values. In this sense, they can be seen both as real utopias and prefigurative practices of a not yet realized communitarian and socialist future. The future in this context doesn't have a realistic connotation. For as Jameson has shown, the truly utopian sense of any collective endeavor in the context of global capitalism would consist precisely of imagining at the present time a future that doesn't reproduce the shrinking of time of an eternal present. This is especially important for the urban poor, which live in very poor conditions, which are very tied to the present time, because they have to live and make a living like in a with very precarious jobs and in very precarious areas. So creating these spaces of hope, creating this creating the sense of community and the sense of future, a non-neoliberal future, is very important. And for us, we just wanted to bring these experiences to the conversation of the symposium. So well, thank you very much for listening, and we are open to discuss and questions.
Many thanks. This has been a very, very interesting presentation. It's about real utopia in the end. And when comparing what Monbiot said in the end, we can change something and we can try new ways. these projects you mentioned are projects our foundation, Ideal Spaces, wants to pursue anyway in the next future, hopefully with your help, in terms of further elaborating the concepts, the background. And I think the important point is that changes are possible without getting into perceptional biases. So we have no alternative. No? So either we have to smash down the existing system, or we have to accept it as more or less fainty individuals. Here are new ways that really work inside an existing context, and interesting as regards our very work at our Ideal Spaces Foundation is the relation between community, history, as a grown place, as a space for a community, and to keep the community itself in condition that a community is able to organize itself and to generate and to grow by itself. What are your impressions?
Much thanks. It's my thinking about community, what the pobladores are doing, and you can see the result with the balconies around the houses for to meeting the neighbors, and in contraire the high houses from ugly investors. And so I think perhaps it could be also placed in other countries, not only Latin American countries, perhaps in some countries in Europe, perhaps in Germany, because at Germany you have to rent a home, and it's so much expensive in the last years. So there are people, they have 3 jobs and they don't find an apartment which they can pay. So many thanks.
Thank you.
Juan Pablo, it's Alan here.
Oh, hi, Alan.
I think that really one of the, there are many lessons that the examples that you provided illustrate, okay? But I think one of the really important, essential notions that you provided with the last example, okay, is that collective community empowerment can create housing based on their own initiative and their own ideas, okay? That part of the neoliberal logic, okay, is that housing can only be created from the top down, okay? And what you defined and the example in Chile presents is an example from the bottom up, okay? And this is not the only example of this kind of housing development. We know historically that there are also other examples, and well, one of the main ideas of like neoliberal logic is that people are too stupid to be able to do the things that they need to do in terms of their own well-being, that we need experts to come in to be able to define what it is that people need, okay? And the examples that you provided showed the opposite of that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan. Yes.
Yeah, my name's Grant. I'm interested because in Santiago, you have a central city area, right? And then you have outskirt areas. And it seems, I just want to make sure I'm right. The central area was where the poor population, if we can use that term, which I don't like to use, where let's say the average population lived, and then they were sort of moved out by the governments to the outer areas. Then they built these areas where there was, I guess, houses flooded and so forth and so on. And then this new development by the group, the really beautiful development that was done is in the center, back into the center of the city. And then the government seemed to build right next to this for some reason. So I just have three questions. Number one is, why did they move back to the center of the city and not build these kind of things for themselves in areas outside? And then why, when they did build this, why did the government decide we're going to build right next door to this instead of the government building in these outside areas? And this is just one. I mean, it's a beautiful construction and everything, and I think it's really well done and it's a good image. But I mean, are they going to be building more of this, or is this what it's limited to? Those are my questions.
Oh, thanks for your questions. Yeah, perhaps I generalized this movement from the city center areas to the outskirts, but there were some areas in which some families they managed to stay in these areas. So Estación Central, each one of these areas. So they didn't move back to the city center. They never were displaced. So they resisted the displacement. So that's why they wanted to build something there, because they were their community, their communa of origin. They resisted the displacement successfully. So, and the other question is not that the state built this ugly building next to the Maestranza project, that the Pobladores one, but it was that the state didn't do anything. So the market built these buildings. These are not like state buildings, but are like the buildings by the state agencies. I mean, like the market buildings. So in that sense, the states allow this to happen. So you have these very two different ideas of cities and community and social relationships very close together, kind of mixed up. But that's thanks to the pobladores, because in other areas of Santiago, you don't have this kind of communitarian projects. So this is kind of exception, the existence of the Maestranza projects in the context of these more neoliberal buildings. So that's go to the other to your other question, which is very important. There are a few new initiatives, which are replicating these Maestranza projects within the same area in Estación Central. The same people, same pobladores organizations are building more of these buildings. They're creating more of these buildings, though they have like stage 1, 2, 3. The picture that you saw is from stage 1, which is like 400 families. And currently they are building stage 2 and stage 3, which are more families. So more family are having access to this type of buildings. And also there are other organizations which are kind of got inspired by these initiatives, and they are trying to replicate this in other comunas, in other municipalities within Santiago. So this is why these initiatives, although are very exceptional in terms of, I mean, quantitatively speaking, are very, very important for other families, for other people, in order to believe and think the other way of thinking of the city and living the city is possible within this neoliberal logic and neoliberal city.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So on that note, I'm going to ask a question that Benda wrote in the chat, that George Monbiot spoke about the tipping point when the impossible, a world beyond neoliberalism, becomes inevitable. What in the history of the Pobladores struggle presented itself as the tipping point? So when did the fight become?
That's a very tricky one, because on the one hand, and I think this is a very specific thing about the Latin American pobladores struggles. This also happened in the favelados in Brazil and also in villas miserias in Argentina. There is a tradition or long history of struggles before neoliberalization, before like so there's a more long history of a struggle of poor people or like average people with elites and like the people with power and so on. So specifically like the tipping point in which a world beyond neoliberalism was able to be imagined like and also enacted in practice. I would say it was the beginning of the 2000s. There were a series of crises of neoliberalism in general in Chile. And perhaps this is also important to mention. The housing crisis it was just one of the crises of neoliberalism in Chile. But at the same time, there was an educational crisis because of the educational neoliberal system. There was also environmental crises and so on. So there was a kind of sense of the idea of neoliberalism is not good for like people, and people started to realize themselves that this was a fact, and also they began to understand that some of the neoliberal logics or products of the neoliberal logics were able to be redirected into a more collective and communitarian sense. I'm not answering the question because I don't know if there is one typing point. I would say that you also have to have like a kind of democratic context in the sense that in one sense the recovery of democracy, of political democracy in Chile also allowed for the pobladores to organize themselves freely in a way. So they've been repressed and all those stuff, but not as much as they were in the dictatorship. So there is a mix, I would say, a mix of political contexts, like a more liberal democratic sort of, but also very strong neoliberal policies and housing policies. The crisis, like which became like more evident, and also this history and traditions to which these pobladores could like rely on, or they invoke. They constantly invoke this memory and the history of the previous pobladores. We also struggled for housing rights, not in a neoliberal context, but in a, I don't know, also like capitalist sort of context. So yeah, I wouldn't say there's like one tipping point, but the sense of crisis of neoliberalism in general, I would say.
I have two very practical questions. So how was the money raised for the building? So how was the financing done?
Yeah.
And the other, how is the ownership organized now? Who owns?
Yeah, that's a very
who
kind of
transitioned into the state of being an owner?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. Thank you. Because this is where the tensions arises, the tensions within this counter-hegemonic project. And this is because fundings come from the state, still come from the state. The only thing that pobladores do is direct like this politics, or redirect this housing policies in their benefit, with their ideas of the city, their buildings, and so on. But the funding still come from the state. The thing is that the state would use that money to build social houses on the outskirts of the city. And the thing that pobladores do is try to press the state to tell the state, you have to build our social housing not on the outskirts, but here in the city center with our families historically lived, when we live, so we can go like and be marginalized or go to the peripheries. So in terms of finding the funding come from the social housing programs which is like still a very neoliberal housing program. The only difference is that they can kind of put another content or new content or their own content within the same infrastructure or economic funding structure or whatever. So related to that, the families and individuals are the one who own their homes. So still the struggle is for private property in a way, and this is why I talk about the tensions. So of course, private property is not like exactly the same idea of private property, like for neoliberal or capitalistic private property, because they manage to collectively create these spaces, and in terms of pressing the state for the building of these spaces. But they still, in terms of law and in terms of economic stuff, it's the same private property regime. I mean, the families and individuals are the one who own the family. So you can have a contradiction between, on the one hand, a very collective effort and managing to create their own spaces, but at the same time, these families want to own their own homes. I mean, it's like kind of a mixing of stuff. It's on the one hand the collective dimension, the communitarian dimension, but they don't want to lose their properties. I mean, they want to feel that they own their own properties as well. And this is kind of where the political like work of the organization is very important, because many people of the poor areas they don't share this communitarian sense, and they say, okay, I want to have my home. I don't want to like fight 5 years to get a collective home. If by fighting 5 years I'm gonna get my home, I prefer to get my home and my housing now. Like, so I prefer to go on the outskirts and have like my right to property right now, and not like wasted time in collective effort and so on. If the result in terms of property, it's gonna be the same. I'm gonna own my home, or my family is gonna own the home. So yes, there's no like collective rights here. This is not like cooperativas. It's not like that. You will find more like of those in, for example, Uruguay, Argentina, or even Brazil, but it's not like a very typical sort of organization or way of getting housing in Chile. So they managed to kind of work within this very neoliberal logic and changes some of the content, but they don't have like the strength to change it, like the structure of the infrastructure, how neoliberal policies work.
So the following up on what you just said, who manages the collective? I mean, they built a project, okay? Someone has to manage the maintenance of that project, okay? Like, who built the playground for the children? Who puts money into that?
The state put money into that, but the planning were made with the participation of pobladores. I mean, the one who said, we want this playground here, we don't want, for example, parking slots, we want to playground for our children and so on. That was the pobladores. So the pobladores actually participated in the planning, but the money comes from the state. Now, in terms of who managing now the projects, they are still the pobladores. They have meetings like every week and every month to keep the spaces clean, to manage the rubbish collections and all the stuff. So it's kind of a mixing of like a very collective like projects within this like how would you say this neoliberal structure or whatever.
I have another question. This I think we heard that people getting involved into their surroundings, into the way their homes are built, is important for them to feel at home.
Yeah.
So my question is there also a link between feeling at home and owning the place? Is there a necessity to become kind of involved capital-wise or ownership-wise and feeling as a member, a full and capable and responsible on long-term self-obligation, being a full member of the society they live in or the community?
Yeah, I would say yes, definitely. I mean, it's both. I mean, they want to have the right. I mean, they want to feel that they own their homes, but also when they become involved, they feel like they are like at home with their homes, like properly, and they like become fully. They feel. I like the word that you used, responsible, for their environments, for this area. So that's the only way they think that they can keep the areas going. I mean, because there is a risk here. In theory, any family living in this building could rent or could sell one of the flats. I mean, they are allowed to do it because they are like within a neoliberal regime, but they don't do it. I mean, still. So and that's why the sense of community and the responsibility of this project is so important. They have to feel that they created this space, that they were fully involved in this space in order to take care of this space, because otherwise other families will come to live in these spaces, and then these families could like sell the flats or rent the flats. So and they can like become in the future like just another like typical building of a neoliberal city. So that's very important, the thing that you mentioned.
Okay, if I may have a last comment before lunch, thank you for clarifying the ownership part. I was going to ask you about that because immediately what came to my mind is the Uruguayan housing cooperatives. So I was not knowing the specific case, I was almost sure that it would be cooperative housing. And I think your story is absolutely important for us because it really complicates the neoliberal story in that sense. And let me just see one thing which you may have mentioned before, and I think the question that you had about insisting on owning your own house is a very German question, if I may say that. Why? Because it's owning something, we tend to think of it without any historical context. But I think owning things in a context when you have a general, taken for granted situation of macroeconomic instability is a different thing. So providing any kind of permanence or at least the impression of it to housing in that game, it's really important to have ownership, and it may be more important in Chile or in Latin America. In general, it may be more important in Eastern Europe than it is in Germany. But I have to say that that I think it's the stability of renting has also changed, if my understanding is correct, even in the German context. So neoliberalism did a few things to the housing market, and also the general economic situation is pushing people, I think, in general, towards certain types of solutions like home ownership, even in places where it was not necessarily the norm. Think of the case of Berlin, for example. So
could I just ask a quick question?
Yes. Like, wait, we can continue until we settle it. You can.
In Red Vienna, do people own their flats in Red Vienna?
No, they rent, but I think there is Red Vienna is a really good idea. Everyone is really happy about it, but I think you have to see it historically. So it has changed. It's changing. You know what it means to rent housing. There is still a huge sector of social housing, but it's becoming I should say less and less typical everywhere in the world, and even in that context, I think it's somewhat changing.
And I just have, it's not a question really, or it's more of just a comment or note, but in Budapest or in Hungary, there are these so-called bérlakás, which belong to the not the city, but well, technically the city, but it belongs to each and every district, and these were the social housings. And if you could get into one of these houses and rent it from the municipality and your district, you basically entered a contract where you would rent it for quite cheap. If you left, they could give it to somebody else, but they can't put you out. And this is a story that I heard from somebody who actually their family got into one of these houses, like their grandmother or their great grandparents, years and years ago in the second district, which is like one of the most expensive and prominent districts. And everything around them has been sold and bought several times, but they're still there. And the council is not really happy about that they're still there. But basically, there's a law that says that as long as somebody from your family is living in that apartment, they can't take it away from you. So what's happened through the generations is that people would move out, but there was always somebody, a child or a young adult or somebody who would live and stay in that apartment. So technically, they're not owning the apartment or the garden, but everything in that apartment is theirs. They are maintaining it, they're taking care of it, but they can't leave it because then they would lose the apartment. So that's a weird kind of concept that we have in Hungary, that these bérlakás or rental apartments, technically that's what the term means, that you could swap them also, for example, but you can't sell them. I think it's a very interesting historical concept that in Budapest.
Can I add something to that? Because it's very like important to the Chilean case. 2 years ago, we had an attempt at replacing and rewriting the Pinochet constitution here in Chile. And one of the constitutional norms that the Pobladores movement put in, because they managed to influence the Constitutional Assembly, they participated within this Constitutional Assembly, this Pobladores movement and these organizations, and they wrote a norm, constitutional norm, which was exactly as the Hungarian examples that allowed the state to, I mean, the people to rent property to the state. They wouldn't like own the homes, but it would work like a very similar way. But the thing is that the proposal was rejected by the majority of the people. So just to illustrate the extent to which the right to ownership and to home ownership is present in the Chilean society, and why it's important. There was conservative forces and right-wing parties. They were campaigning with the motto, "The state will steal your home," even when people don't own home and they rent. But they made sense for some people, so they got scared and they rejected the proposal. So at least they have some people in Chile, they have the idea that they will become owners of their home at some point someday, and they felt threatened that like kind of expectation with the constitutional proposal, and that's why in part that's why it was rejected.
Please, are there any other ideas?
Hello, Rodriguez.
Yep.
First of all, say you that the model that you present is very beautiful in the same way that another models that we know about Aravena, the Pritzker Prize that you you have. They win the Pritzker Prize with projects in the same way in the social housing social projects. But we discussed earlier. This is a kind of I always said programs with very difficulties. Brazil have a big, largest program to make. I think is the Casas Populares. I think is the name of project. It's made 1 million houses in 10 years, and the program gone wrong. They start to building a lot of houses, and I think is when Vilma was president, and nobody knows where is the money, nobody knows where is the houses, nobody knows nothing about that. What I'm trying to say is, I believe in that kind of programs. When we are made this kind of housing, I have several doubts that is possible. Look to this like a model extended for all of part of the society, because we can't live, we can't give for every people a house. I don't know if you believe or if you agree or not agree with me. This is a model. This is a model that a good way to do the things in these circumstances for the public housing, but it's difficult to understand this or extend these programs or for other part of for everything. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that I agree with you. I mean, it's a very realistic point of view. I wouldn't say that you can replicate this model to the entire, like the managing for like cities in general, but I would say two things. First, what these experiences show us is that the right to the city can be done other ways in general. Not perhaps not this specific way, but perhaps there are like other ways in which people could get involved, or at least get like good quality housing, especially for poor families. And that's the second point. This kind of experiences, it's focused on very poor families. I mean, it's just one. So perhaps it is a solution, and it can be replicated with some like poor families on certain cities. Of course, the reality of Santiago is different from realities of other cities in the country as well. So I think we can also have to look at the conditions of for example, rural areas and so on. I don't think the pobladores themselves want to replicate and make this logic or this project like the only way of doing or getting the right to the city even in Santiago. But I do think that they show us that at least you can change a little bit the landscape by doing things other way in general. Otherwise, I mean, the concept of those ways have to be created and collectively created and negotiated and so on. But I think they are thinking, and perhaps that's why the word of the presentation of the title is resisting, because it's kind of, well, we would become the residents of this other type of buildings, the building that I show you the picture. Yep. But we manage to resist that and instead living in this other type of buildings. So of course the like neoliberal logic is like more like present in not only Santiago, it's around the world. So these access are experiences how this the effects of these policies can be at some point resisted. I don't think unfortunately that we are at the stage of thinking of completely removing this logic. Of course, it has not not to do only with housing. It's like just, I mean, it's a financial system, and it's very complicated through institutional mechanism and so on, with different realities in different countries. So yeah, I would say it's not the ideas to replicate like universally this model, just to show that the things can be like done in other ways,
Done
especially
well.
for those poor families.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other comments, ideas?
I think relating to this question that Hugo asked is that one of the problems with the neoliberal paradigm is that the neoliberal paradigm doesn't imagine that there are different possibilities or different ways of like creating housing for people, okay? And that it's something that John Roberts yesterday like alluded to was that in London there was lots of like social housing, okay, public housing, and these projects were created by architectural groupings that were not firms specifically, but like a district architectural office, okay, like for a different sector of the city, and they would like design the housing for that district, okay, and that housing that they created for that district didn't have to be replicated in another district. It can be used as like one alternative example of how to create housing, okay? And what happened is that what John mentioned was that Thatcher came in and basically destroyed that model, okay? So you have existing models of how to create housing that are not like one-dimensional. They create, there are different possibilities of how to design and create housing which is accessible to